we have to be honest to the students that, okay, you want to be a serious journalist, this is what's going to happen to you.
Um, what drew you to journalism, and was there a moment when you knew that this was your path?
Uh, Actually, the long and short of it is that when I was in elementary and high school, much as I hate to admit it, I was very bad at writing, whether in English or in Filipino. I was more inclined in the math and the sciences because you don't need to write an essay to explain that 1 plus 1 equals 2, or that the square root of 144 is 12. So the answer is precise. Now, you have to understand that I graduated from high school in 1986, which, as we all know, is quite historical. That was the first people power. And I saw the power of media in terms of how it can help in the shaping of public opinion. So that's the deeper political motivation for me to go into journalism. Now, on a more shallow and selfish part, I chose journalism to some extent as a challenge, as a personal challenge, because if I'm able to quote unquote excel in math and science in high school, maybe, just maybe, I can be good enough uh, to graduate in the premier state university in in a discipline that is practically my Waterloo. So my sister and I, my younger sister and I, sort of had that bet because she excelled in journalism and writing in elementary and high school. And when she went to college, she ended up with a double degree in chemistry and computer engineering, which was supposed to be my field, if you think about it, because that's my natural trajectory. So that was the personal aspect of it. But right now, since we're commemorating EDSA People Power 1 in February, this month, I need to stress the obvious that, there is also a political angle aside from, the personal and selfish aspect of going into journalism.
Prof,
So
if
it
I may
seems
ask,
like okay.
Sure, go ahead.
oh, sorry, yeah, if you go back to it, did you have any regrets not pushing for the science and the math side instead?
And no regrets really, because if I may be allowed to continue my story, of course, in my first year, there were no journalism subjects yet, because these were all, well, as you know, general education subjects. So uh, there were no challenges whatsoever. But I have to admit, I began to doubt myself when I started taking communication and journalism subjects, especially when you have professors who have such high standards and would assume that you already know how to write. I mean, look, you have to understand, at a young age, my expectation was that my professors will teach me how to write. And of course, the painful reality is that no one can really teach you. You have to do it yourself. Now, there were some regrets, but I tried to push the envelope, so to speak, by applying as a writer, as a news writer for the Philippine Collegian, the student publication of UP Diliman. Luckily, I got accepted, and I have to admit that my experience with the Collegian complemented well whatever it is that I learned in the classroom. So that was one of the turning points. And with regard to your question as to I regretted something while pursuing journalism, yeah, I mean, make no mistake about it. At certain points, you begin to doubt yourself. But the regret, I don't think it prospered much, or it percolated in my head for a long time, because I was able to learn how to write. And unlike my counterparts or my classmates in journalism courses who already knew how to write and were actually award-winning writers even in high school, yeah, there were a lot of them. I'm still able to somehow survive, journalism school. And to some extent, I was lucky enough to graduate cum laude. And I was adjudged the most outstanding journalism student of my batch at that particular time. So you also have to understand at that time, cum laude was a big deal because unlike today where it's now a dime a dozen. So there were, yeah, I do remember our batch, we didn't even have a summa cum laude. We only had one magna cum laude, and the rest of the Latin honor graduates were cum laudes already. So, yeah, those were interesting times then.
As someone who is a product of the same university, nagigets ko po ang grade inflation.
Yeah.
Galing po ako ng film, so kaya sinabi ko kanina
Ah.
na mass communication, iba na nga pala ang pangalan.
Yes.
Yes. During my time, Prof, di pa naman kami ganun kadami na mga laude-laude, pero gets ko yung grade inflation talaga. And I
Yeah.
think that's a testament on how parang accolades are, parang they don't really matter as much, or it
Well,
dilutes the meaning.
Well, yeah, actually, that's a valid point. Although we also have to understand that things are much different now compared to before. I'm not sure. Well, you look young, so I'm guessing that during your time you already had the internet. But during our time, we really had to struggle to research. I do remember that my thesis then was written using, di nyo na alam to, WordStar. The precursor of Microsoft Word. So there were no footnotes under WordStar version 4. I remember that very well because my biggest regret then, yeah, talking about regrets, this was my regret. I finished the thesis and that was immediately after I submitted the thesis, that was the time when a software program called WordPerfect, which is the competitor of WordStar, which I used, it began to introduce the footnote option. So, yeah, so I treated WordStar as something like a glorified typewriter at that particular time while writing the thesis. So, anyway, yeah, those were happy times. But going back to our discussion on journalism, I could say that I was lucky, if you'll consider that, to be, pursuing journalism at a time when you needed diligence and patience, not just in writing, but also in finalizing the drafts. I do remember going back to writing the thesis, I didn't have a personal computer then. Laptops were still at its infancy. So what I did was to just type using, the manual typewriter. You know what I'm talking about, right? I hope I don't sound too Jurassic for you guys. So, and then during my spare time, I would handwrite the thesis. And then when I finalize, that's the time when I go to a computer rental shop to type. And I have to do it quickly because the rental shop charges by the hour. So actually what I learned, one of the good things my mother did was when I was in elementary school, I don't remember, summer, grade 5, I was going to grade 6. By then, I was enrolled in a typing school where I learned touch typing at a young age. So, yeah, so I benefited a lot from, being exposed to vocational education while still in elementary years. And yeah, it became useful. And even up to now, I still know how to touch type. So that's one of the tools of the trade in journalism anyway. So in a sense, you can say that directly or indirectly, the stars tend to align because the skills you need in journalism, I learned along the way. My mother at that time, had no inkling as to what career or what course I would want to pursue. The other skill that I can tell you is that speed reading became also useful in college. And I also learned speed reading at a young age. There's a formal course just like typing for speed reading, where they would teach you how to read quickly with a higher degree of comprehension. The only disadvantage there is that the speed reading course was designed for texts in English. So for Filipino texts, I can speed read also, but it's a different principle when you apply whatever it is that you learn. So anyway, maybe I'm talking too much, but the point here is the bottom line is that in my case, the experience was quite unique because it's not just because of the um, People's Uprising in 1986 that more or less defined where I really want to go, where I saw the political significance of the discipline that I pursued. But also the fact that it's a happy coincidence that I'm able to learn related skills at a young age, even if I have to admit the most important part, which is the love for writing, it came much later. It came only in college. Okay? And luckily, because of the Philippine Collegian, I've learned the discipline of writing and I got to like it. Okay? Unlike in the past where I really, really hated writing. So, yeah.
Thank you, Prof. Danny. It seems that you've really straddled a lot of contradictions, tensions, and identities, even growing up, and even keeping up with technology. I think I'd want to explore more about these tensions. Like some people say that journalism and activism shouldn't go together. Like journalists should remain neutral, but you seem to reject that binary. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah, well, the old notion of journalism is that journalists should be neutral, yes. A journalist should not take sides, and the journalist should only report the facts. Let the people decide, so to speak. Well, here's the problem. Because when you talk about information is not just about data, it's about analysis. And when you realize that truth telling is not just about facts, it's also about context. So that's why accuracy in journalism is seen as factual accuracy and contextual accuracy. It's true that facts can be value neutral. In other words, 1 plus 1 equals 2. That's it. There's nothing political about it. However, when you try to make sense of the reality, for example, 1 plus 1 could be 5 depending on how corrupt you are or depending on the person that you're talking to, right? So the context can be uh, interpreted in various ways depending on the analytical framework that you have. For example, when you talk about wages, low wages of workers, people would say from a capitalist point of view, it's a necessary evil to maintain the sustainability of business operations. And actually, don't get me wrong, that's a valid point. But from the point of view of the workers who need to survive, okay, not just to work the next day, but also, to provide for the family, you need to increase the wages. So for the journalists, the challenge is how do you strike that balance between the two if you want to be neutral in a situation where interests are irreconcilable? What is the middle ground between a capitalist who wants profit and the worker who wants to have a living wage? For example, someone's got to give. So the journalist should be able to provide the meaningful analysis for the betterment of, not really everybody, but for the sector that needs it the most. That's why one point of view in journalism is that the journalist should give a voice to the voiceless. The voiceless are already deprived of basic services. The voiceless are already, victims of double standards of the law. Do we need to also victimize them with the so-called neutrality of the journalist. Because when we talk about neutrality, you want to maintain the status quo. But the status quo is already unacceptable for the marginalized and the underrepresented. So that's why, in terms of journalism as giving a voice to the voiceless, it makes better sense, especially for, a country like ours that would be mired in contradictions, that would have a plethora of problems. Name it, we have it, right? It's not as if we are a highly consumerized society. I mean, we're not like Denmark or Norway or Canada, where even the headlines of newspapers would include a dead squirrel, and then there would be candle lighting for a dead squirrel found at a train station. I'm not kidding. That happened in Canada. Uh, I'm not saying it's always a slow news day, but they make a big deal out of such things for the simple reason that they can literally afford to do it, right? So in our case, even dead cats on the highways don't make the news anymore because it's normal. It happens normally. So, that those things should be duly considered when we talk about journalism, activism, or the fact that what you have right now is, you know, the existence of crusading journalists who try to fight for what is right, and at the same time, he or she is also doing the work of a journalist. And we also have to understand that in the Philippines, there are two traditions of the media. One is the dominant media, the one that we're familiar with, which has a corporate orientation, and the other one is the alternative media. So it's the one that functions mainly out of commitment, not really out of employment. So that's why upon graduating from college, my trajectory has been to help out in the alternative media. Although I have to admit, I have some experience with the dominant media as well. But, for the most part of my journalism life, it's mainly devoted to the alternative media. So, yeah. And even up to now, I'm still doing it.
Yes, Prof, we are avid readers of Pinoy Weekly, ang inyong
Good.
lingguhang column.
Okay,
Maraming salamat
good.
po for that. I guess, parang trying to channel it back to journalism and how you are as a professor. Did it change how you taught students about power? Because you were talking about dominant media, alternative media, in the age of, I don't want to say the A word, but in the age of big tech
Yeah.
technologies that are actually co-opting, miring, murking the waters of information. Did you ever have any shifts on how you taught power?
Okay, in terms of the wielding of power and influence, more or less it's the same. It's but there are of course considerations with regard to the consolidation of power by the ruling elite, taking into account changes in technology. It's just like the elections, the shift from manual elections to the automated election system. I mean the power of political families, of big business operations, they still lord over the election systems. But for example, when it comes to fraud or various forms of cheating, they change with the adoption of the automated election system. Now, with journalism, the ownership of the means of production for the media owners, it remains the same. But with the internet, there are some nuances that we have to remember because we've also empowered ordinary people to use social media as a platform. Okay? So there is that nuance. So the concept of citizen journalism has already been there, but with the new media, we've seen this grow by leaps and bounds, so to speak. So to be more practical about it, it's now much cheaper to express yourself. And you do so not just locally, but even globally, right? So you can choose to do that if you choose English, for example. But if you choose to do Filipino, that's also fine because you're not just confined as a citizen journalist to a particular locality. Your medium, your platform can also go nationwide. It can reach, the remote rural areas, assuming they have access to the internet as well. We have to remember that unlike more than 20 years ago, right now, internet penetration rate is growing. If I'm not mistaken, Internet World Stats would put it from a little more than 85%, 85 to 90, if I'm not mistaken. Other indicators would show the same trend through the years. So the growth has been exponential in terms of internet penetration rate. And, rightly or wrongly, telecommunications firms have provided free access to Facebook or to TikTok, even for prepaid services. So that's part of their package already. So somehow it helps, although there are some nuances and limitations there. So the use of power, the bottom line here is that the rich and powerful still consolidate their forces, but there is some limited space that can be maximized by the marginalized and underrepresented. And to the credit of many influencers and content creators, they're trying to make a difference. Okay? Not really comparable to how the rich and powerful would be able to, increase their reach because of their vast resources, but at least they're making a dent. Okay? So, yeah, so that's how I view it. So, are there changes through the years? Of course, the technology would tend to bring about certain nuances in the ownership of the means of production. But qualitatively speaking, the polarizing difference between the rich and powerful and the ones who are oppressed, they still remain despite changes in technology. So it's the nuances that would have to be clearly explained to today's generations of students.
Hi, Prof. I just want to go back to one of your earlier points on the dominant and the alternative media. So I used to write as an intern for an alternative weekly in Baguio before. So community journalism is kind of close to my heart. So I want to get
Northern
your thoughts.
Dispatch, if you don't mind my asking. Nordis?
Baguio Chronicle, but I used to cover
Baguio
with
Chronicle.
Northeast.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a good tabloid also. Yeah, anyway.
Yes. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on what Frenchie May's conviction on terror financing tell us about the state of journalism in the Philippines, and taking off from that, what are the implications for worker safety, particularly for community journalists?
Yeah, what happened to Frenchie May is really most unfortunate. And to be honest with you, last January 2027, was it January 27? But anyway, I was expecting her to be acquitted of all charges. You know why? It's because in February 2020, when she was arrested, the crime that she was accused of was just simply illegal possession of firearms and explosives. That's it. Okay? Now, fast forward to this year, when she got convicted only for terrorist financing, which was the charge that was only a supplemental charge, in the sense that I think it was a year or so during her detention that the charges were filed. Okay? And I found the decision to be quite haphazard, in the sense that the only evidence that was leveled against Frenchie May was that she was allegedly at an area where she gave 100,000 pesos or so to an NPA commander or an NPA official, along with Mariel Domequil. Okay? which was weird because it was only based on the statement by four ex NPA members. I think this is very unacceptable. And just like the Committee to Protect Journalists and the Reporters Sans Frontier and other international organizations that question the judgment, I think it's a warning and it's a chilling effect. And the chilling effect, rather, is real for journalists because, red tagging is really a very, very serious issue. You have to remember that Frenchie May was red tagged, she was surveilled, she was repeatedly harassed and intimidated prior to being arrested. So that's why many journalists, including me, have that firm commitment that we will not forget about Frenchie May and we will not say that, okay, she was convicted. We have to respect the decision of the court. The struggle is over. Definitely not. It won't be over. So we will look forward to the day when she will be finally acquitted. We hope that the motion for reconsideration will be duly considered by the judge, and even if it is not considered, I think there is reason to make it reach the higher levels of the court, including the Supreme Court, because we consider this, as you correctly noted, as a press freedom issue. We don't want journalists being silenced because of the path that they took, which is basically advocacy journalism. And, Frenchie May, just like me, has taken a clear choice to help develop the alternative media. In this case, it's Eastern Vista, where she was the executive director. And if I'm not mistaken, she was also a broadcaster for a local community station, also in Tacloban. Yeah. Interestingly, Frenchie May was also one of my key respondents in the dissertation on journalism and culture of impunity. So you can say that in a way, without Frenchie May, I wouldn't be able to finish the doctoral studies in Germany. So I owe a lot to Frenchie May for helping sharpen the analysis in the dissertation.
To follow up, Prof, so
Sure.
how can we better protect, I guess, media workers? What should be our goal at the policy level? What should be advocating for?
Well, there are already efforts to continuously call out the powers that be whenever they do something bad to the media. And they happen quite often. Actually, if you look at some pending bills in Congress, there are proposals to legislate, for example, fake news, which can be weaponized to quell critical commentary. So there are a lot. The passage of the anti-terror law, where by extension having contacts with known terrorist groups or terrorist individuals could land you into trouble. So even, journalists, the powers that be under the anti-terror law are telling journalists who should they talk to. Okay, so the problem here is if we normalize the anti-terror law, if we allow it to prosper, there will come a time when those who are red tagged cannot be interviewed by the media anymore. There will be, stricter policies about it. Those things would have to be considered. The Cybercrime Prevention Act is still very much around. And we all know that, reminiscent of the Aves de Rapina or Birds of Prey in the past, libel or even cyber libel has been weaponized through the years. And under the Cybercrime Prevention Act, the penalty for imprisonment for libel has increased to 12 years, from 7 years to 12 years. So the chilling effect is also there. Actually, there's a lot of for lack of a better term, there's a laundry list of, faults that we can think of with regard to the government. But aside from the law, the actual practice of harassing and intimidating the press through creative means, they've been happening through the years. So actually, this information should also be seen along that line. It's not just the conscious effort to provide wrong information to people. It's also the effort to discredit the press and make it appear that the fake news peddlers are the quote-unquote alternative media, or that they are the alternative to what more responsible journalists are doing. So therein lies that particular problem, because the effort to campaign against the media or to isolate the people from the media, they've been happening through the years. You can see some subtle hits. Richard Gomez calling out some journalists for, the interview requests. You know that, right? And he even used the U word, ungas, yung mga taong yon, etc. Of course, he apologized, but, the damage has been done. And it reflects how the rich and powerful are viewing the media. They should be at their beck and call. And they can be called ungas, conveniently. I guess the only difference with Richard Gomez is that he was stupid enough to post something like that. But that's the feeling of many of the rich and powerful. Yeah. I don't take it back. It's really stupid of him to do that. And I can say that because he used to be a student of UP in the 1990s, a special student, non-credit student. He took some courses in CMC. So that's why, yeah, I'm embarrassed to admit it, but those are the facts. Yeah.
Prof, have you ever reached the point when you ask yourself, bakit ba kasi ito ang pinaglalaban ko? Bakit? Why is this the path that I chose? Ganun ba?
Well, okay. Actually, it's a bit of a personal question, but generally, there are no regrets. But I have to admit, in the 1990s, when I still didn't know how to save money and how to, properly budget whatever finances, whatever limited finances I have to admit, there were some doubts. Maybe I can take a leave of absence from what I'm doing. I'll go corporate maybe for 1 year, enrich myself, and then come back. Okay? Those thoughts come to mind. Okay? And and I think it's normal, and I have no compunction, openly admitting that, because my biggest flex is that I'm able to fight such temptations or whatever thoughts come to mind. And I have to admit, when I became a visiting professor in Korea for 1 year, that was 2009, there were offers for me to stay there more permanently. And you have to understand, at that particular time, I was earning 5 times more than what I earn in the Philippines. I think I was assistant professor. Yeah, I was assistant professor at that particular time. I was earning 5 times more. So actually, if you do the math, if you only stay for 3 years in Korea, that would be equivalent to 15 years of my salary in the country. So I will be made already, right? I can retire happily, assuming that what I have would be a simple lifestyle, not the Zaldico type of lifestyle, because that would be forever. But nevertheless, again, the biggest flex is that, again, with the support of my wife, she respected my decision. So I'm able to resist the temptation. But I have to admit, did it ever cross my mind? Did I, fantasize or visualize what's going to happen to me if I get, that much money in just a few years' time? Of course. But you have to understand, if that was 2009, actually, I can renew my contract for another year in Korea in 2010. But what happened in 2010, that was the national elections already. I felt that I have to be there. I already felt guilty being in Korea in 2009 when the Ampatuan massacre happened, right? November 2009 yon, right? So I can only advocate and issue certain statements or make certain remarks from the comforts of Korea while my colleagues are suffering and people were crying because of what's happening, and you know uh, I was living the good life in Korea then. So I'm not saying it was, well, to some extent, it's a guilt trip. Don't get me wrong. But I felt the need to go back. I mean, I already experienced Korea. It was wonderful. The people are kind, etc., etc. I learned how to read Korean and to speak Korean to some extent. I learned K-pop and Hallyu and all that. But I have to come back. So there were, so the regrets, sorry, not really regrets, but the doubts can enter your mind, maybe for a short time. But when you're really resolved and you know that this is the right thing to do, it's something like, it's hard to explain, but it's something like you go back to auto mode that, okay, you fantasized about it, let's go back to what we're doing, and because this is important. So, not to be mechanistic about it, but that's the thought process that happens. Okay? Yeah. I hope I made sense in that explanation.
What then, Prof, would be a champagne moment for you? Na para bang, oh, finally, this is happening in the media or in journalism in the Philippines, to finally make you have that sigh of relief? Or will that ever happen?
Meron ba, Prof? Parang,
Yeah.
Meron.
It's a bit, well, it's like this. I don't mean to be too pessimistic for this particular podcast, but there are a lot of problems facing the country right now. And, I have to admit, at 58 years old, I doubt if I will, be able, I doubt if I'll still be alive by the time when there will be radical changes, not just in media, but also in society in general. Because whatever changes we want in media, there has to be concomitant changes in the ownership of the means of production, particularly in Philippine society. So, yeah, if you want to be realistic about it, I doubt if it will happen, given the fact that I'm already 58 years old. If you were talking to me at 25 years old, then maybe I can be more optimistic to say that I can still be alive by the time that those changes will happen or some manifestations of it will happen. But having said that, I'm happy still that unlike in the past, right now we're seeing good, changes in the media. To be honest with you, when we started Bulatlat in 2001, so that we're now celebrating our 25 years, this is our 25th year, by the way, we were treated as something like second-class citizens in journalism. Second class in the sense that we were seen as pseudo-journalists or just simply activists pretending to be journalists. There was that general perception. But we were able to prove ourselves in Bulatlat. And we're able to also see the day when we have a lot of people from Bulatlat doing well. They get awards, they get recognitions, not just here, but also globally. When we started Bulatlat, we were just a few people, but now we have a lot of writers already. You look at the staff box of Bulatlat, it's now full of people. Before, it was just simply, just a few of us, and we're all multitasking. Considering that we don't pay anybody anything, that speaks a lot. So in a way, I'm not saying that that's already the end or I'm already happy, I can die tomorrow. That's not the case, but I'm still happy nevertheless. So we see something, we see some fruits, not of my labor, but of the collective labor. So it's not me. I did not do it single-handedly, but I only helped to make sure that these things happen. That cannot be
Right.
denied, I think. Yeah, yes.
Yeah. So, Prof, like journalism as a movement, and you teach students to be
Mm.
journalists. Did you ever tell them na, uy, wag na to, iba na lang ang gawin nyo. Ready na ba kayo na maghirap? Ready na ba kayo maglupa? Yun. Ready na ba kayo to, always be on guard, have that almost hyper-vigilance when it comes to your safety and the safety of the people and the communities that you want to tell stories of?
That's always the orientation in my class on day one. We tell them the reality of journalism, but we don't tell them don't do this anymore given the reality. Actually, it's the other way around. You have to persevere to make sure that things will change for the better. Okay? But we have to be we have to be honest to the students that okay, you want to be a serious journalist, this is what's gonna happen to you. And I tell them about what I go through as a journalist. And, that's the good thing about being a practitioner and a teacher at the same time. You can use the classroom to share whatever it is that you've experienced. Actually, the more recent ones you can share. Sometimes there are cases when immediately after, a coverage, I would go to class and then the lesson for the day would be what I just covered or what I just experienced. I mean, those things I think are more useful to the journalism students. Of course, at the same time, we also have to look at the classics and the other readings. That's also non-negotiable. So yes, to answer your question, journalism education should be very, very relevant. They should be up to date. There's a lot of problem in various journalism schools right now, not just UP, where sometimes you hire, I'm sorry to say, public relations practitioners or PR specialists to teach journalism. Or even in the K-12 program, I've had that sorry experience where sometimes the teacher does not know anything about journalism, but they are good writers because they are English majors. As if journalism is just about language or just about, expressing yourself. I mean, of course, that's one aspect of it, but more than expressing yourself, how do you analyze critically? How do you relate with people? I mean, I'm not saying that, well, don't get me wrong. Journalism is inherently an extroverted field. I mean, but it doesn't mean that to be a journalist, you have to be an extrovert. You can be an introvert, but at the same time, deal with different kinds of people. What you only need to establish is an open mind. I mean, I also speak from experience. I'm also an extrovert, and even up to now, I still am. Okay? I prefer my, personal space, even if I'm already married with children. I mean, I need to, I need time to be alone, especially when I'm writing. So you can have that particular quirk, if you call that a personality quirk, but going back to the issue of journalism, what you cannot compromise is the need for you to be not just a good writer. I mean, being a good writer is important and being able to express yourself is important, whether in English or in Filipino. Filipino is, of course, the more preferred language here. But at the same time, dealing with different kinds of people would also have to be instilled in the minds of students. The teacher can only go to the extent of constantly reminding them of what needs to be done. Just like Trip to Quiapo, Ricky Lee wrote a very, very good piece about writing. Hindi intensyon ng librong ito na turuan ka magsulat, buhay ang gagawa nito. So it's just like the way you deal with different kinds of people, your values, even your religion can define or sometimes prevent you from dealing with different kinds of people. So as a teacher, you have to encourage them to do so. So that's why it's not surprising that I require them to write about topics that are not really within their comfort zones. Sometimes students are required to go to urban poor communities. If we can afford it, they have to go out of town to talk to farming communities. Well, maybe Cavite or Tagaytay could do the trick, but nevertheless, you don't just rely on your circle of friends or your social class. You have to go beyond your social class. So, yeah, so more or less that's how I view the teaching of journalism.
And I guess like students are really lucky to have you as their professor. Um, we're down to our final question. So thank you so much, Prof. Danny, for all the insights and all the wisdom that you
Yeah.
have shared so far. I guess our next question is about asking questions. You mentioned being able to think critically. You mentioned being able to parse information, analyze, and really
Mm.
frame things in a very critical manner with regards to which interests are being put forward, etc.
Yeah.
So, what kind of questions should journalists be asking right now?
Of course, the basic 5 Ws and 1 H are non-negotiable. Who, where, what, when, why, and how. But there are two questions that should be constantly asked regardless of what you're covering. So what? It's the analysis of the issue. And the other one, which is equally important, is what now? The recommendations would have to be clearly established. So there's a saying in social science research, a criticism is as good as the alternative. So you must be able to provide viable courses of action that people can do. You know, it can be an issue about, let's say, cleanliness in the community. Okay? There's no debate that we have to clean the community, but how do you do it? Okay? Where do you throw the trash? Do you segregate? Okay? Or for example, if you want to oppose mining, just like what's happening in Dupax del Norte, why did the people still defy a legitimate court order telling them to lift the barricades and let Wagel Mining Corporation in? Because the people that we're referring to have been longtime residents of Dupax del Norte in Nueva Vizcaya. They are indigenous peoples and they view land not as their ownership but as something that is integrated to their living. They want to protect the land because the land will protect them, right? And the land will outlive all of us, right? So that is something that the mining corporations do not understand because they're just after profit. They want to do large scale mining. I mean, don't get me wrong, let's be fair to the mining corporation. They promise a good life to the residents. They promise that they will be employed, or at least most of them will be employed. But why is it that people refuse? They're not brainwashed by left-leaning groups. Far from it, they already know the consequences of destroying, cutting down trees and destroying their plantations. They're not anti-development. What they want is sustainable development. So what is your role as a journalist? You have to ensure that these voices are heard. And you have to ensure that the kind of development that we aspire for is not the official narrative of development where you would have high-rise buildings, you would have high-tech equipment, and you would have sprawling golf courses, and you will be sipping wine as you see the sunset from an artificial beach that's created from the blood, sweat, and tears of the laborers. You know, those things would have to be clearly explained to the people. So, going back to your question, those are the questions. Actually, there are a lot of questions that should be asked. But, aside from so what and what now, development for whom? Or just simply for whom? Para kanino? When you talk about UP and you have that construction, that aberration called UP Shopping Center, aka Dili Mall, simpleng tanong, para kanino ba yon? For whom is that? Okay, you created that. Okay, it's a nice building, good architecture, very nice. But it's for whom? Because I don't see community, residents going there, buying or availing of the goods and services. You get what I mean? Just like the UP Town Center, for whom is it really? I'm sorry for sounding a bit UP-centric, but those are the realities in the university, but this also redounds to the realities elsewhere. BGC for whom? Why do we need to, tell people to leave the premises in BGC just because they are dressed differently? Do people feel threatened by the way we dress? Okay? And what's with the word gang gang? Those questions would have to be asked by a more crusading and a more responsible journalist. Yeah, I think I said too much already.
Thank you so much, Prof. Danny. I think we're
Sure.
down to our last question.
Okay,
And-
sure.
So in development management, we have one course that's called Strategic Foresight or Futures
Mm.
Thinking. And this kind of invites us to imagine different kinds of futures. Inherently, it is hopeful. Other times, it prepares us for like different kinds of scenarios and how we're able to, transport ourselves to different worlds, so to speak. For you, Prof, what keeps you hopeful? And how do you imagine a future for journalism in the country or communications in general?
Well, the future for the country is somewhat reflected in the book that we recently edited. It's called The Future of Media in Asia. There are three basic parts there: artificial intelligence, digital technology, and media practice. So let me answer your last question first. Of course, the future of journalism remains bright for as long as there are students who are willing to take on the dangerous path of truth telling, regardless of the dangers that it brings, that they bring. And I'm very happy that you don't need to convince them because actually it's the reverse. They're the ones convincing me to continue what I'm doing because they are already firmly resolved to doing what is right. And of course, in terms of the prospects for society in general, the movement for change is there. I mean, regardless of one's political ideology, people see the need to act accordingly. And what's revealing last year, and one of the sources of inspiration, I guess, for many people, is that the public perception toward activism or even joining rallies, they're now seen as necessary. Unlike in the past where people will dismiss it and just say that we have better things to do. But now, things are different. Of course, I don't want to make light of it, but sometimes I'm beginning to think that we owe Marcos Jr. a lot for uniting people against, him. But of course, I'm just joking here. The bottom line is that for journalists, that particular responsibility remains. The technologies may change, and it's possible that, in the next few years, we would see advances with the way we practice journalism, but the normative standards still remain. The responsibility for the truth, the need to fight for what is right, and the need to give a voice to the voiceless will still be there. Because we have to remember, when we talk about progress, I mean, it's possible for the Philippines to gain some degree of development or to progress. Okay? It's possible. But the question here is, for whom is that progress? Is it for selected political dynasties and big business interests only? So for as long as oppression remains, the fight still continues. So I guess that's the main lesson for journalism students today and for the journalism students of tomorrow. Again, regardless of the technology, the crusade for change should still happen.